Warm welcome to the British Library. Today we are hosting this evening together with the Polish Cultural Institute, to whom we are very, very grateful for enabling us to have our wonderful guest tonight with us. We are here tonight to celebrate a Polish artist, Stanisław Wyspiański, and I would like to start this evening with a quote from one of his letters to his friends. "Something strange happens to my imagination when I read these things. I see everything. I hear the clash of weapons. I hear voices. I see dresses, garments, bodies, horses, ever-changing landscapes. All of it glides through me somehow, before eyes, yet not before my eyes, across my brow, yet not in its surface, so that absorbed in reading, I lose the room's walls from my thoughts and find myself in an intermediate certainty where scenes surge and flow, one after another. And the more vividly I see them, the more silently they become like misty images, moving and alive with gestures. Then, suddenly, when I lift my head from the book, all the phantoms disappear from around me and the play of hearing begins again. Once more I hear speech, the sounds of words spoken in ever different voices, the neighing of horses, the clash of swords, the rustle." Wyspiański possessed an imagination so intense that he could feel words printed on the page. He could feel them around him. This inner theater became one with his art, a wellspring of inspiration, of life, inseparable from existence. And we are here today to celebrate this wonderful man who brought this extraordinary imagination to life through his art. And he was a true polymath of young Poland, as we'll hear shortly from our guests. Tonight we gathered together with three wonderful guests. Dr. Alison Smith, Director of Collection and Research at the Wallace Collection, London, who was formerly Chief Curator at the National Portrait Gallery, and co-curator of Stanisław Wyspiański portrait exhibition that is currently being displayed in the National Portrait Gallery. And we encourage you to go and see it, because this is one of the reasons why we are here together tonight. Another of our esteemed guest is Dr. Julia Griffin, an art historian and curator specializing in British and Polish art, co-editor of Stanisław Wyspiański portraits and co-curator of Young Poland, the Polish Art and Crafts Movement in William Morris Gallery. And this wonderful exhibition was co-curated with Roisin Inglesby, who is with us tonight, who is a curator at the William Morris Gallery, and together with Julia put together this extraordinary exhibition. Roisin also has in her portfolio an exhibition Pioneers William Morris at the Bauhaus and Minguet, Art Without Heroes. Please warmly welcome our guests tonight. Once again, thank you so much for coming, and hopefully you will enjoy our conversation. Let me start with Alison. Alison, as I mentioned, you recently co-curated the exhibition on Wyspiański's portrait in National Portrait Gallery. I think this is something astounding. I don't think we were able to see so much of Wyspiański's works out of Poland in a very long time, if ever.
Thank you. Yes, just to say, this is the first exhibition ever on Wyspiański in the United Kingdom. And I think it's my understanding that his works have very rarely been shown outside of Poland. And I think this explains why this small display at the National Portrait Gallery, which is on until mid-July, has come across as such a revelation to visitors, people in Britain and people who've come from overseas. And everyone I've encountered in the exhibition space just tells me how mesmerising the portraits are. So it is a unique event, and if you haven't seen the display, it is free, it's open to everyone. Do go along. It's open until, I think, the 15th of July or something like that.
So you say that it never has happened before, so how come it was possible now?
I think it happened, that's a long story, but I think the reason Wyspiański hasn't been shown outside of Poland, this relates to the drawings, the portraits in particular, is that they are executed in pastel. And pastel is friable, so it's quite sort of brittle, it's sort of dry, like, it can flake. And I think the museums have been very cautious about lending these works because they are so fragile. And I think also the art of Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, not quite so well known. I think it's only in recent years that art historians have been looking beyond the sort of Western or the American canon, as it were, to sort of embrace other artists.
Thank you, Alison. Julia, because I think we are speaking as presuming that everyone in the audience know who Wyspiański is. Could you maybe do a little introduction to this wonderful figure?
Certainly. Thank you. Certainly. We would need to remain in this room for a few days to be able to do him justice. All I would say is that he was a driving force behind the Young Poland movement, which was a branch of the international arts and crafts movement. Wyspiański, he was born in 1869 and died at the very young age of 38 in 1907. But during his life, he revolutionized Polish art and design and made a significant contribution to Poland regaining independence at the end of the First World War in 1918. He was a reformer, he was a polymath, he was a painter, a playwright, a designer, master craftsman. He designed stained glass, furniture, textiles. He directed his own plays and did the stage designs. He had a holistic approach to everything he did. He was an antiquarian, a scholar, an activist, a counsellor, and today he's the most loved artist in Poland, and he probably made the greatest mark on design.
This is amazing, and as the title of our event says, he was sort of like Polish William Morris. Roisin, could you elaborate on this maybe? Because what Julia described, it's very much similar in a way to art and crafts movements and what William Morris was doing here in the British Isles. What are your thoughts on this?
Hello, everybody. I'm sure most of you are familiar to some extent with William Morris. I think I've spotted one tie in the audience, so at least somebody is familiar with Morris's work. But most of the things that Julia was talking about just now could also be applied to William Morris. Morris is a bit older. He's born in 1834. He dies in 1896. And he's considered the kind of founding force behind the British arts and crafts movement, which was a movement in Britain, which then spread out into the wider world, aimed at kind of recovering craft skills and integrating kind of thoughtful, ethical, environmentally conscious ways of making sort of back into society. It was very much a response to the Industrial Revolution, and the reason that the arts and crafts movement sort of starts in Britain is most likely because Britain is where the Industrial Revolution starts, and sort of it then spreads out into Europe and beyond. Kind of in tandem with this industrialized society and a desire to kind of get back to what is deemed important. For Morris, this sort of manifests in various ways. So he starts off, actually he starts off as a painter, then a foray into architecture, a brief one. He's a poet, he is a textile designer, he designs wallpaper, stained glass, and then the final kind of venture, artistic venture that he does is book production. So he mirrors Wyspiański in many ways as a result of this. But what makes the arts and crafts movement special and distinctive and so powerful is that it also has a very strong social and political dimension. And it's not just about beautiful things. It's not just about style. It's very much about the relationship between people, politics, society, and objects. And that's why it becomes such a potent force. And so Morris spreads, through his writings and through the writings of others, sort of, across Europe and beyond. But it's not just the patterns, it's not just the aesthetics. In fact, in many respects, it's much more about the power of material culture, the power of design, the power of making things to change the society around us. And I think that's one of the resonances with Wyspiański and Young Poland.
Would you both agree with this? Alison?
Yes, I think there are lots of points of connection between Morris and Wyspiański. And Morris, of course, being the older artist, the older of the two, he would have exerted an influence on Wyspiański as a sort of young artist and aspiring designer. And we do know that Morris's writings were translated into Polish, and various of the journals, Wyspiański contributed to did also feature articles on Morris, and also Morris's great collaborator, Edward Burne-Jones, who was a great influence on Wyspiański. And in fact, Wyspiański, in his most famous play, Wesele, or The Wedding, actually sort of quotes Burne-Jones, doesn't he, when he describes the Jewish innkeeper's daughter, Rachela. He describes her like a vision from Burne-Jones. So he was obviously aware of his work. But I think about the points of connection, Roisin mentioned they are both polymaths. They started off as painters, though Wyspiański was a much better painter than Morris. But they went into book design, typography, textiles, furniture. But maybe, we were discussing this earlier on, Morris had perhaps a more collaborative approach. He agreed in this idea of the workshop, craftspeople working together. Whereas I think if we're thinking about differences, maybe Wyspiański was more the artist who wanted total control of his own productions. And it's quite telling that Wyspiański, outside his famous blue studio in which street? In Krodarska Street, yes. You pronounce it better than I would. He had a notice saying, Stanisław Wyspiański at work, do not disturb, whatever. Whereas I don't think Morris would ever have put up a sign like that outside of his studio. It would have been, come in, all are welcome to participate in these wonderful craft activities. So I think there are differences in creative personality, but I think both their art was both underpinned by a need to serve society at large, either through political transformation in the case of Morris, and in the cause of Polish independence in the case of Wyspiański. Julia, I'm sure you've got more to say.
Just to add that for both men, the two main passions and sources of inspiration were history on the one hand and nature on the other. And Wyspiański had a marvelous way of conjuring up sense of place through a combination of indigenous plants and historical relics, which I think is a striking commonality with Morris.
I would follow up on this one, on 2 points you said, because we were indeed discussing the collaborative side of Wyspiański's and Morris at a few minutes before our conversation started here. And we had a workshop yesterday for PhD students and from the Cultural Institute, master students and undergrad students, and we're showing some books to them by Wyspiański. And what was striking was how many books he illustrated for his friends. So he was not opposed to working with them, but as you said, he worked from his perspective and artistic vision, and he added to their work, but they worked separately so it's not the same like with William and Morris. And on the point that his work was very deeply rooted in national spirit and even national, Julia pointed out yesterday during our conversation that he made trips to Vistula River to make sketches of national plants. Wasn't this the case? And then they were as illustrations in his books. Can you say something about this, Julia?
Certainly. So yes, as we were chatting earlier, Morris had two design firms. Morris Marshall Faulkner and Co., which later evolved into Morris and Co., and the Kelmscott Press, set up in the 1890s with a number of collaborators, whereas Wyspiański did not have a workshop. He, as Alison said, conceived all the designs by himself and commissioned local artisans to create them according to his designs, so a slightly different working pattern. And in terms of his preoccupation with indigenous plants, he created a herbal of native plants from the banks of the Vistula River, including the yellow stinging nettle, which later became the chief protagonist of the cover of the Krakow Annual, which was a conservation journal set up by Wyspiański. And other indigenous plants, and the herbal became a sort of portfolio for his future design projects.
Roisin, how was it reflected, how the natural patterns were reflected in Morris's work, and what was his way of thinking about links between nature and what he was producing?
So Morris is, completely inspired by nature. So he grows up in East London, and his family have a big house in East London with extensive grounds. And so when he's a child, he kind of rides around, Epping Forest on a pony. He, runs about the garden. He's always immersed in nature as being a very young boy. It's interesting that Julia mentioned a herbal because Morris's parents, or his father, owned a very old, a sort of 16th century herbal called Gerard's Herbal. And Morris, even as a young child, kind of pores through this and is really interested in illustrations of plants. And that certainly kind of comes with him. Like Wyspiański, he's interested in sort of local indigenous plants and sort of the English hedgerow, the English countryside, as opposed to the kind of hothouse flowers that would have been more fashionable, the kind of imported hothouse flowers that would have been fashionable in sort of more traditional Victorian design. So he certainly kind of associates nature and landscape with a sort of indigenous Englishness, I suppose. Morris's project is certainly not nationalistic in the sense that we would think of sort of nationalism today. He's the opposite in a sense, but he does have a great affection for the English countryside, and this kind of comes out into his socialism as well, because for him, sort of historic buildings and the natural world are sort of linked in a kind of romantic way. Kind of landscape and history are kind of there together, and there's maybe not so much distinction in his mind between the historic man-made, a 1,000-year-old church and a hill. It's sort of in his mind, it seems very similar. And he fervently believes that the country belongs to everybody, and that includes not just the landscape, but also the buildings. And so as a result of this, he's interested not only in sort of landscape preservation, and he does work to kind of try and counter the effects of destruction of the landscape, but also of historic buildings that he fervently believes do belong to everybody. So for him, this is it's a political project, and it's not nationalistic in the sense of the nation state, but it's very much about preserving national heritage for everybody as a socialist project.
Thank you. That's fascinating, especially what you said about him and preserving buildings and sketching fragments, because this is what actually Wyspiański was doing. He was sketching, he was going around the country to little villages and little churches and was sketching fragments of sculptures or ornaments. Alison, do you see other similarities between those men in their working process? Especially how they were preparing to put out the final result of the work in between sketching and then putting either the stained glass or a portrait. Can you recreate it? Were they really that similar, or is it just...
Well, I think if you look at Wyspiański's portrait, which of course is the subject I've been working on in relation to this exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery, Wyspiański's approach to portraiture was very distinctive. We could almost say it's peculiar to him alone, and he was a great observer of human beings. He was academically trained. He went to Paris. He studied at one of the ateliers, the Studio Colorossi. So if you actually look at his early life drawings, they are academic, they're perfect, but they're a bit dull, they're a bit boring. Any other student could have produced them. But something extraordinary happens when he returns to Krakow and starts mixing with other intellectuals and artists at the Bohemian Café Paun, and something just almost electrifies him. And whether this was due to influences he picked up in Paris, such as meeting Gauguin, for example, discovering the work of artists who work in pastel, because he reacted against oil painting and decided to work in pastel. But also the quotation you gave at the beginning about him absorbing all these sounds and influences. He's fascinated by Greek vase painting, by Japanese art, and of course Poland was right in the middle of the route when Japanese prints travelled across Europe. They came via Poland. So that's a huge influence. Other Polish artists, Jan Matejko, his mentor, all these influences are coming together, Morris, Burne-Jones. And what he ends up with is this wonderful linear style. These contours take on a life of their own. They're very, very decorative, like the contours, the lead lines you get in stained glass. And then the use of colour is very bright and decorative. But what's extraordinary about Wyspiański, how he manages to balance these abstract decorative qualities with this penetrating psychological insight. And this makes him very different from Morris. I think Morris's art is far more benign and generous to humankind than Wyspiański's. People used to say of Wyspiański's portraits that he was ripping their souls apart. So it's more like Edvard Munch, an exhibition I've also been working on at the Portrait Gallery. And this relates to the theories of Stanisław Wyspiański, who knew Munch and knew Wyspiański too. And this idea of psychic naturalism, or the naked soul, the idea that the artist should get beyond the mask we all put on when we confront people in daily life, and just really get to grips with these unconscious impulses, motivations and feelings. And Wyspiański does this through the way he uses line. You can almost feel he's sculpting the line, and how he uses contour and modulates the tone. You feel he's actually sort of digging into the person and exploring them. And that is very, very unique. And then he knows how to compose. This is the decorative artist in him, which relates to his work, like Morris, in textiles and tapestry. He knows when to leave the surface of paper blank. And so he allows the so-called negative areas of the composition to participate as much in the composition as the drawn areas. So you get this sort of incredible energy and dynamism in the compositions. And he also knows how to flatten the composition, uses asymmetry and gesture. You mentioned at the beginning how important gesture was for him. And if you actually look at his portraits, all the figures, the characters are sort of sitting in different ways, so you can almost sort of read into their minds and their thought process, which is why some people felt uncomfortable about them. Also, Wyspiański had a sort of an edge to him. It's often said about his portraits that he painted them, he drew them. He had great ambitions, like the theatre. He wanted to create a hall of fame of portraits of his contemporaries. And a few years later, he felt so disgruntled or dissatisfied that so few of his colleagues, these so-called outstanding Krakowians, had lived up to his expectations. So he summoned them one by one to his studio and said, take your portrait, you're not worthy, you're not worthy of it. So I don't know how Morris would have behaved in that. So the more I talk about them, the more I think they're very different, even though they were both worked in the applied arts, and they wrote so much. Morris wrote these sagas, didn't he, as well, and poems, The Earthly Paradise. So you see all points of connection. But I think creatively their personalities were moving in different directions. Julie, I don't know what you think.
I've been just reflecting on the question whilst listening to Alison's response. It's a difficult question. I suppose the biggest parallel between them was in the field of designing repeating patterns, mainly repeating floral patterns, because they both had a genius for ornament. It came very easily to them, and they both single-handedly created these patterns in one sitting by themselves. There are quotes from Wyspiański describing his ease at going down to the banks of the Vistula River, just picking up a plant, and how his drawing would naturally flow into a repeating pattern, which he so fantastically realized on the walls of the Franciscan church, the gigantic pansies and nasturtiums and roses that we were able to show with Roisin at the William Morris Gallery. So that was a similarity between the two men. In terms of designing stained glass, for example, Wyspiański again was able to conceive the whole design and draw it by himself, whereas there are stories that Morris was never very confident when it came to depicting faces of the figures or animals, and that Morris would design and draw the overall pattern, but would get Edward Burne-Jones to do the faces and Philip Webb to do the animals. But in terms of another commonality, both artists sought to break down the entrenched distinction between fine and decorative arts. So, for example, Morris's early paintings were very decorative. For example, his label Isolde, was very rich in kind of the decorative arts being used as props within the picture plane. So they definitely, and similarly with Morris's stained glass designs, he really went an extra mile in terms of creating real emotive tension. So that's a big commonality, I suppose.
I can.
No, I was just thinking about the kind of the decorative painting. We have a drawing at the gallery done by Morris, and it's a pencil drawing of Jane, his wife. And she's dressed up in a sort of medieval costume, and it's just a very simple drawing. It's a sketch for something else, and she's sort of holding up her sleeve, and it's a very kind of long draping kind of medieval sleeve. And I always describe it less as a portrait of a woman in a dress than as a portrait of a dress with a woman inside it. Because I think his sort of, Morris is definitely kind of pre-Freudian in the sense that I don't believe the sort of psychological drama in his understanding of sort of depictions. He's definitely doesn't have that sort of sensibility at all. But his interest in the decorative arts definitely kind of makes up for his lack of confidence, perhaps lack of talent in depicting people, and I think Morris, especially with women, is quite a kind of shy character. He doesn't have a sort of social ease, even with his own wife. I don't think he ever had a real social ease, and of course the parallel being with Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who drew Jane fantastically, and they had a long relationship, and that kind of, I always feel a bit sad when I look at Morris's pictures of Jane because they're so shy and awkward in a way, whereas Rossetti Rosettis are so confident and so fluent. But the portraits the paintings that he does do, the very few of them, they're much more interested or confident with the decorative arts surrounding the figures than they are with the figures themselves.
Roisin, you touch on a very interesting subject of women, and I see another parallel in between them, because they both of them like to break other boundaries, class boundaries. And I know that at some point Wyspiański said that he, it's not a direct quote, but he preferred a book from Miss Zosia because he wanted to read more than date her. But then he actually married below his station, just as Morris did, correct? So do you think that Morris's shyness towards his wife had to do something with this? Maybe not. What are the parallels between the two men and how they looked at the class issue and the being true to themselves? And because I see it as a connection in between what they do in the arts and what they do with their lives. Like they wanted to get to the bottom of a sense of being, dig out that soul, you said, Alison. So they had to be true to their emotions, and they couldn't pass, they should have passed the boundaries of the class system if they wanted actually to connect with another being, right?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I think Morris he's an absolute romantic, real romantic, but a sort of almost perhaps a juvenile romantic in his relationship with women. He sees Jane, so he goes to Oxford. So Morris is a firmly middle class family. His father's a stockbroker, they are wealthy, they have money. He goes to Oxford University. He meets Edward Burne-Jones, who is actually from a lower I'd say Burne-Jones is sort of lower middle class, whereas Morris is sort of middle class. But they are both obviously university educated. He meets Jane through Rossetti. Jane's father is a stable hand, and her mother, doesn't have a profession, obviously, as most women didn't, but it's possible that her mother was illiterate. So Jane is definitely from a much lower social group. Morris falls head over heels, in part because Jane is so extraordinarily looking, and he kind of, I think, kind of marries his sort of artistic inspiration and sort of romanticism about the past, about the medieval past, and sort of applies it to Jane, so projects it on Jane a bit. And there's a fantastic quote from Henry James, the American author who came to have dinner with the Morrises, much later. And he says, it's hard to work out whether Jane is the original and the kind of arts and crafts sort of pre-Raphaelite painting movement, is sort of around her, or is she the facsimile of the movement and she's just been made into their ideal? So, does the inspiration come from her, or does she, is she made by them? So it's an interesting relationship, and it certainly, does break down class barriers. And Morris's family, would have found this difficult. It must also have been difficult for Jane because she's propelled into, a world that she's not, prepared for socially, and so she definitely has sort of, education, I suppose, of etiquette and training, and she has to be kind of brought into this world. And so I don't know whether the sort of faltering nature of parts of their relationship are to do with this class boundary or whether it's to do with other things. But it's an interesting kind of early kind of statement from Morris, I suppose, that he doesn't care what society think, and he's not going to do what his family expect. And he has lots of siblings, and apart from one, most of them are pretty sort of normal, stolid, middle-class people, and Christmases become increasingly difficult at the family house once Morris becomes a revolutionary socialist, and his family aren't quite sure what to do with that. So Jane, I suppose, is an early indication that he's going to go his own way and do what he wants.
So, Julia, what about you? Because Wyspiański married a peasant woman, Teodora Pytko, and he was not the only one in his circle of artists and colleagues who's done it. And thanks to, I think, his marriage to Teodora and his friend marriage to another woman, we have the biggest, one of the biggest Polish dramas, Wesele, who everyone in Polish school has to know.
Certainly, I will just make one additional comment to Roisin's response. I believe that Morris's choice of his wife was both an indication of his free will and critical mind and a kind of stubbornness to go his own way, but also possibly an early indication of his commitment to social equality and sort of his egalitarian outlook, possibly. In the case of Wyspiański, the Young Poland movement developed a preoccupation with vernacular craft as a symbolic repository of primeval Polish design and kind of primeval Polish heritage and cultural identity. So there was a lot of artistic preoccupation with the material culture of Krakowian peasants and also Highlander shepherds because of that reason, including their vernacular architecture, their craft traditions such as wood carving, embroidery. A number of Polish cultural figures from the upper and upper middle classes married peasant women, including Wyspiański and his best friend, the poet Lucjan Rydl, the protagonist of the wedding play. And in those days, these intermarriages were considered as a symbol of unifying the divided Polish nation. Certainly in the case of the Wyspiańskis, Teodora Teofilia was a very charismatic lady. She spoke in a beautiful peasant dialect. She was a fantastic storyteller of folk tales. She was a very good embroiderer, like Jane. And also she took pride in wearing a sort of a folk costume. So she provided inspiration for Wyspiański's art. They even worked on one embroidery, on at least one embroidery together. So he definitely lived an authentic life, which informed his art. Alison, would you like to add?
Yes, I think it also has to consider the sort of family dynamic as well around both these artists. Morris had sort of two daughters. One experienced problems with her health, but May Morris went on to become, a very important designer in her own right. So I think they were both, through these marriages, they actually sort of, wanted to sort of, further the cause of, women's rights, women's emancipation. And we know that, Wyspiański, even though he did encounter prejudice and resistance from his family when he married Teodora, he was adamant he was going to do this. And what their relationship was like, I don't really know. Obviously, there was deep affection. He sort of obviously was very fond of her, thought she was I think she's a great storyteller, and you could see her influence on his writings and also her embroidery work. But also, I think she was quite a tough character. If you look at her, I don't know the portrait of her.
I actually wanted to show her on the portrait, but it keeps moving on from this and going to the Wawel Castle, but you could see her face, right?
She's obviously maybe a tougher person than Jane, I don't know. But obviously, she held her own within that relationship. And it's quite interesting, the sort of, the family they had around them, because obviously they were very close. And if you actually look at Wyspiański's portrayals of Teodora and the children, they are very affectionate. And these have become sort of icons of Polish art, particularly the drawing titled Maternity, which shows Teodora nursing the youngest son, Stas, with Helenka, the oldest daughter, his only daughter, sort of looking on. They're full of deep affection, and that obviously conveys something about they had this very close family life. And also it's interesting, when Wyspiański died in 1907, that family fell apart. Teodora married someone else. She moved apart. The children were sent to schools. They ran away from the schools. One of the children ended up in a psychiatric institute and died young. Another one went off into the army and died somewhere in Russia. Another one ended up in a psychiatric institution too. So it was only the daughter seemed to live a sort of fulfilling life, and she became the bearer of Wyspiański's flames, you could say. She maintained his reputation. So there was obviously, I should imagine there was quite a lot of tension in that relationship, because it was a marriage across these class boundaries. And I think for a respectable Krakowian to marry a peasant woman, it was obviously a political gesture. As you said, it was about uniting all the classes in the cause of independence. But also we do know that Wyspiański did have to encounter resistance from his aunt at that moment. His mother died when he was young. And his father was an alcoholic. So I think there was an issue to do with mental health in the family. But I think there was a certain amount of resistance. So, but at least he had the sort of support, like the Pre-Raphaelites did, and the artists in the arts and crafts movement, of people in their own artistic milieu. They supported them. So there's Tetmeyer wasn't there, and Rydell, they also married peasant women. So I think Wyspiański would have found support in that respect.
You mentioned a political statement in what you said, and our presentation keeps bringing us back to the Wawel Castle behind you. So I wanted to actually come back to this so that we can explain this image. Julia, could you say how this political sentiment of Wyspiański translated into his art and building the national identity and national unity, which an example is actually behind you?
Thank you. In terms of the political context, as a result of an unprecedented political catastrophe, Poland ceased to exist as a state in 1795 as a result of its progressive invasion and subjugation by the neighboring countries, Prussia in the west, Russia in the east, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the south. And Poland ceased to exist for 123 years. It only regained independence at the end of the First World War. When Wyspiański became an artist in the 1880s into the 1890s, Poland hadn't existed as a state for a century. However, the cultural identity of the people was never stronger. Ironically, the cultural identity of the Polish people was never stronger, because during the years of the political subjugation, they did use literature and the arts to preserve and to hold on to their identity despite being persecuted, etc. All aspects of Wyspiański's art aimed at maintaining the Polish cultural identity and kind of reflecting on Poland's history and on its future. And a good example is the
Acropolis, right?
is the project Acropolis, which is currently shown on the screen. So. The city of Kraków, which was one of the beating hearts of the Young Poland movement, was Poland's oldest capital and the seat of the Polish monarchs at the Wawel Castle and on Wawel Hill. It was a sacred location, a symbolic sacred location for the Polish people, with the nearby Wawel Cathedral, which was the place of burial and coronations of the Polish kings, so very much like Westminster Cathedral. And what was particularly humiliating for Poles was that the Austrian authorities appropriated Wawel Castle and used it as barracks, military barracks, which was the ultimate act of humiliation, and in the process they caused a lot of destruction to the historical complex. So when the complex was being vacated by 1904, Wyspiański and his architect friend Ekielski began to kind of articulate their dreams for the Wawel Hill as a very innovative kind of development project, and they envisaged that the hill becoming the kind of the modern day Acropolis, the site of all the key cultural and political institutions, including the headquarters of the National Museum, the headquarters of the Academy of Learning, the headquarters of the National Theatre, and actually the detailed plans for the complex, which never materialized, were published by Ekielski shortly after Wyspiański's death in 1908. It's a fascinating read.
Roisin, is there anything similar in Morris's work? I know you said it's not nationalistic in this in a similar way to Wyspiański, but it's in a way very patriotic, that he goes to the root of the English and British culture. How does it present in his artwork?
I suppose it presents in some respects in his final project, which is his book project. Morris is really interested in literature, and he loves books. And actually, for all his, Morris was a deeply committed socialist, and he spent the last several years of his life, traipsing around the country, speaking at working men's clubs and, at miners' strikes. And, he's absolutely, dedicated to the socialist cause. At the same time, he's expending an enormous amount of money on books, very, very fancy, expensive books. And they're his real they're his luxury items. And so he's very interested in historic literature. And when he sets up the Kelmscott Press, as Julia mentioned, one of the things that he does is reproduce historic books that, he really loves. And Chaucer is one of them. And so I think that, Morris does not have... If the context is completely different. I mean, of course, Britain being kind of the centre of, the world's empire at that stage, Morris does not come from a point of view where he needs to try and build any kind of sort of national kind of consensus. In fact, it's the opposite. Morris is, very keen to sort of destroy as much national consensus as possible. But his way of kind of preserving, sort of the culture and the literary culture, and doing that through preserving books and sort of the materiality, kind of making, I suppose, intangible culture material and making it beautiful, and to some extent available. I mean, the Kelmscott Chaucer is a very expensive book, but they do produce cheaper books as well. But to kind of that sort of sense of national preservation, I think, comes across probably most strongly in his literary endeavours.
Doesn't he sort of call his book Pocket Cathedrals? And I think that's an interesting term, that the idea that a book can be like a building in itself, assembled of different parts, but a wonderful sort of entity.
I think for both of them, books were complete projects, right? They looked at them as this was actually a work of art. It was supposed to be work of art. But I wanted to come back to you, Alison, regarding this trail of thought, because I know that you looked at his portraits, but you also looked at his other paintings. How do you think his thinking about his country was illustrated in his art, in both actually in portraits as well? Because let's look at Theodora and her garments, right? This is actually a translation of Polish folk style, and it is a statement, isn't it?
Yes, I think, Wyspiański's love of Poland, its culture, its history and nature runs through everything he produces. So in the portraits, often you see it in the sort of symbolism in the background, particularly the indigenous plants. So that famous image, Maternity, which is an icon of Polish art I mentioned before. There are geraniums in the background, which I think he called Krakowian ducklings or something, didn't he? Like they all line up in a row like ducks, but also fuchsias. So you do see a lot of flowers, ribbons, folk costume. He loved drawing Theodora in her, her peasant dress, and all the wonderful bright colours. So that's really important. But you see it in his stained glass. There's a lot of flowers in the glass, also in his textiles, chrysanthemums. What are the other chestnuts in the medical society in Krakow? Everywhere is full of nature, and also this love of ancient buildings. When he was a young man, he took himself on this tour through Poland, through Central Eastern Europe, all the way to Paris, just studying the medieval churches. And I think that's another parallel with Morris, who as a young man went off with Burne-Jones and someone else, can't remember who the other one was. They went to France, northern France, and went to Bruges and studied all the the medieval architecture there. So I think medievalism is something which brings together both artists, but it's something Wyspiański looks back to that medieval heritage, but the idea he should revive it in the present. So his art can't be described as being sort of backward looking or just pure pastiche, because whatever he draws or creates through the decorative arts, design work, it's very, very modern. It actually has a successionist quality to it. So you can compare him to our Nouveau artists, even though he's hated that term. But this wonderful binding use of line, the decorative colour, the flat abstract qualities, makes him very much a modern artist rather than an artist who sort of just merely looked back to the past. And I think that's another interesting point about Morris and Wyspiański, how they saw themselves as embedded in sort of local indigenous traditions, but they were transnational at the same time. There was a universality to their art, which they wanted to appeal to all people. And then, though Wyspiański had this sort of this political side to his art, but I think he saw it as transcending Poland and sort of speaking out to sort of other nations as well.
He was transcending Poland, and he also was transcending time, which neatly brings us to idea of time. And I think that we can wrap up with legacy of Wyspiański, so that you have time for questions later on. What do you think is a biggest legacy of Wyspiański's and Morris? Because their art was, I would say, timeless, and each time we look at it right now, it's a source of countless, endless inspirations for many generations to come, and I'm in awe of what they did and how they affect our feelings, how still their art after so many years affects our soul. What is the legacy of those both, Julia?
Oh, thank you. I hope that Alison and Roisin will help me answer that very wide-ranging and sort of crucial question. I had the pleasure of co-authoring one of the essays in the catalogue that accompanies Alison's exhibition. And I will say that we were delighted to learn just yesterday that it has almost sold out. The Wyspiański Portraits catalogue, there are only 200 copies left. So if you're interested, ladies and gentlemen,
product placements.
You can place your order on the National Portrait Gallery's website or pop into the shop there. But in our essay, Alison and I argue that despite his very short life, Wyspiański made a huge impact on how Poles define their cultural identity, and throughout Poland's stormy history, ever since his death, Wyspiański's paintings, including that of the children and the wife, have been used and resorted to as emblems of the Polish cultural identity at times of greatest trouble, including during the Second World War, when the Temersons produced a propaganda film in 1944 called Calling Mr. Smith. It's a film showing the extent of the German invasion of Poland. It was produced to inform the British public about the extent of the monstrosities. And there, Wyspiański's portrait of Helenka, featured in Alison's display, and Chopin's music are shown as the two chief emblems of the Polish cultural identity, which we found very, very moving. Going from the sublime to the ridiculous, there is a fashion chain in Poland called Medicine, and at the moment there is a range inspired by Wyspiański's pansies for men and women.
Not ridiculous, beautiful.
It is beautiful, and I'm about to kind of stock up. Yes, and I will hand over to Alison and to Roisin.
Well, just picking up that thread, I mean, Morris fabrics are everywhere. People can buy skirts, blouses, ties, you name it. So I think, Morris's influence is just, it is everywhere. I should say that Morris is probably at the peak of his reputation now, not just in terms of fashion, but also his ecological awareness, sensitivity to the environment, and our heritage as well. So I think when people really care for the environment, the polluted water always makes me think, when I hear this thing about sewage in the rivers, I always think about Morris and the Merton Mills and the Wandle. So I think he's uppermost in our minds at the moment. He's a really important figure in that he's someone who we've got to keep on our toes. We've got to be sensitive and care for the environment. And I think for Polish people, Wyspiański is part of their conscience. It's about keeping Polish identity alive when it feels threatened, and also being sort of critical, because Wyspiański was very critical of Polish society as well. He didn't just extol it, he also felt there was this apathy as well, when people should be sort of more aware. And maybe that's also true of William Morris. So I think they're both like they're ghostly presences, these phantoms from the past who've come alive, like Wyspiański's ghosts from the past, and they're hovering over us and just watching what we're going to do next.
Yes, and we actually have an exhibition on at the William Morris Gallery at the moment called Morris Mania, the tagline being how Britain's greatest designer went viral. And it sort of speaks exactly to what Alison is saying about how, Morris it's everywhere. And the sort of benefits of the democratization of his designs, and the fact that they are accessible to people like never before, and clearly incredibly popular and have this timeless resonance. But then also the kind of the tensions and the negative aspects of that, and how Morris's patterns have been kind of disassociated from his political understanding of making. And so if you have a plastic iPhone case that's made in China in sweatshop conditions and it's got Strawberry Thief on it, to what extent is that William Morris? And it's a very it's a very difficult line to tread, because of course not everybody can afford handmade things in the way, and Morris's products were unaffordable to almost everybody. But at the same time, to what extent is it acceptable to him or to us to kind of continue the propagation of his designs alienated from making? And so I think that's the question that he really poses today, is how can you make things well, how can you make them affordable, how can you make them beautiful without damaging the workers, the society around us, and crucially the environment. And I mean, that is something that we are all grappling with. And Morris, he doesn't have the answers to this, all of the answers, but he certainly helps people think through the questions. And I think that's that's what I think is the most significant aspect of his thinking for today.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the three of them. Let's give them a big round of applause.
Where is it possible to see Wyspiański stained glass?
Mainly in Krakow. If you go to Krakow, the place to go is the Franciscan Friary, where you have these magnificent stained glass windows in honour of St. Francis, the Blessed Salomia, and God the Father creating the world. And they are incredible. They were made between the 1890s and about 1904, but they look so contemporary and modern. And compared to, if you compare them with Morris's stained glass, it makes Morris look very static by comparison. That's not to sort of downgrade Morris's stained glass, which is actually fantastic, but in a very different way. But these are so vital. They're so sort of electric and full of energy, and these are incredible colours. So you have to see stained glass in situ. Stained glass doesn't reproduce very well. So if you want to see Wyspiański's stained glass, you go to Krakow and you go to the Franciscan Friary and you go to the Medical Society, where you see the Apollo Copernicus window, which shows Apollo and the planets. Is that right, Julia? You could say more.
That's right. I would also recommend visiting the Stained Glass Museum in Krakow, which is absolutely fantastic. It's the building is actually the original Żeleński stained glass workshop, where Wyspiański had many of his designs produced. And I would also recommend going to the Wyspiański Museum, which is a branch of the National Museum in Krakow, which has got some fantastic stained glass cartoons.
Sorry, I would like to add something. I don't know if you agree with me, but I think Wyspiański was mostly trying to preserve the Polish culture, because Russian and German, because there was partition of Poland, right? So only Austro-Hungarian part was allowing Polish culture to exist, while the other parts, Prussia and Russia, didn't allow that culture to exist. So I think using term nationalism, or that term that you used, is not quite right. He was trying to preserve Polish culture rather than be nationalistic, or whatever term you used. And another thing about socialism, does William Morris Museum allowed to use the designs for free, or do you charge? So this is two comments.
So William Morris is out of copyright. So there is nothing stopping you or anybody else from taking a photograph of a William Morris, thing and using it. You can make a tea towel, you can make a T-shirt, you can do whatever you want with it. But that's not our socialist principles. That's just copyright legislation. We do image licensing, and so depending on what it's for, if it's for an academic publication, it tends to be free. If it's licensing, it tends to be charged, because that's we're a free museum run by the council. So licensing is a very significant. It literally pays my wages. So as Morris would have understood, I think there was a balance between business acumen and socialist principles. But the museum itself is free, and there is nothing stopping you coming in and taking photographs and using it, and using it for whatever you wish. They're copyright free, exactly. So there is no, we get outraged emails from people sometimes saying, I saw this and it's terrible, and do something. I was like, well, we can't, there's that's that. So, but we do find that some brands like to work with the gallery because they like access to the stores, the collections, and they like the kind of, I suppose, the cultural legitimacy of working with an institution and feeling that they're supporting it, rather than just stealing images from the internet and then doing as they wish.
As to your other point about Wyspiański preserving Polish culture, I think that's totally true, but I think he was doing more than that. If he was just merely preserving, it would be documentation, conservation, looking after it. That would be rather static, it would be lying dormant. I think he wanted to revive it, and he wanted to revive it in a modern idiom so it would live in the future and for his present generation. And that's why I think he looks back to the past, but he adapts it in his own unique way. I don't know if you'd like to add to that.
Thank you. Yes, I couldn't agree with Alison more. And also to say that during the 19th century, during Poland's political subjugation by the three hostile neighbors, the Polish people organized a number of military uprisings, all of which were quashed. So they understood that the arts were perhaps a more effective and a more enduring way of perpetuating their cultural identity. And whereas the history paintings produced by master Jan Matejko were a very effective way of kind of reminding people about the past glories and enticing people to continue fighting for independence, these were only available through temporary exhibitions and engravings, and their circulation was limited. Which is why the Young Poland movement emerged as an all-encompassing movement with an unprecedented flourishing of all the arts, not just fine arts, not just easel paintings, but crucially everyday objects ranging from the coffee cup to curtains. All of these objects, as well as interior decoration schemes and the architecture of entire houses, became subversive carriers of the Polish cultural identity and proved decisive in the country eventually regaining independence and in the people not losing their identity.
So adding to that question, we saw the beautiful pictures of Chochoły painting. Would you mind to tell us a little bit more about this and about the symbolic behind that painting?
Certainly. Olga, I don't suppose we've got a reproduction of Chochoły, have we?
I think there is somewhere in this presentation, in the stubber presentation.
Oh, how about that?
Here you go.
How about that? Marvelous. So this is probably one of Wyspiański's most iconic works, and although it looks like a landscape, it's also a symbolic portrait of Polish society. It's a symbolic portrait of his generation. So what you see in the image it's actually a nighttime scene of the Planty Park in Kraków, which is a public park next to the Wawel Castle and Cathedral. In fact, what you see in the top right corner is an outline of the cathedral and of the castle, and in the foreground there are some rose bushes which are covered in straw, which is a practice continued in Poland up till today because the winters can be very cold. It's frequently -20. So wrapping delicate flowers in straw is a protective measure against frost. But what Wyspiański is doing in this powerful and ambivalent allegory of his young Poland generation, he's posing a double question. At that point, the Polish people became quite despondent and quite lethargic and a little bit doubtful about the prospects of regaining independence after decades and decades of ongoing subjugation. So, the metaphor of the metaphor of a straw man, right? Because the title of the painting, Chochoły, literally means a straw-covered bush, but it can be translated as a straw man. So the metaphor of the straw man being just a figurehead, someone who's supposed to do a job, but they're too lethargic, they're too passive. By that point, Wyspiański's generation may have become a little bit passive, but maybe no longer willing to continue fighting for independence or having a moment of doubt. But on the other hand, the question Wyspiański is commenting on is whether, when the spring comes, the metaphorical spring, if it comes, if independence comes and if the straw gets removed, would the roses have survived? Would they have survived the frost? In other words, you know, would the Polish people have survived with their distinctive identity as a nation? Alison, would you be able to add?
I think you've summed it up, actually. Yes, it's an ambivalent image. It's either, you know, looking at them as being sort of, you know, passive and lethargic, or they're preserving, as you mentioned, preserving their culture. They're waiting for their moment to arise, really, or to emerge as a nation. So I think it's got this dual aspect to it.
And it features very heavily in the wedding, in his
It
drama.
does, yes, because the whole sort of, you know, the people at the wedding, they are first challenged when the straw man comes in. He's the first of the ghosts, isn't he, to sort of, you know, emerge, yes, and disturb the proceedings.
First of all, thank you very much for the fascinating discussion. It's so cool to learn more about both these wonderful artists. I wanted to start with a funny confusion that I had on my way here as I was rushing from work 10 minutes to 6, and my kind friends were directed me, oh, it's on the first floor, conservation room. And I like, you mean conservation on conversation? So, yeah, given that we're having a conversation in a conservation room, I'd like to give you a field to tell us more. I mean, we heard little bits and pieces about how both artists cared about conservation and how they either created or, as kids, were fascinated by herbals. But was there more? Was there more impact on conservation in both our countries?
So Morris is one of his sort of, it's at the gallery, it's one of the hardest things to illustrate because so it's architectural and it's very difficult to illustrate architecture inside a different building. But one of Morris's most significant legacies is that he found or co-founded the Society of Protection of Ancient Buildings, which is still going. It's still it's a building conservation society. What's significant about it is this is before there are any laws in Britain or in fact the world more generally about preserving historic buildings. So in the 19th century, the situation was that if you owned a building, you could do whatever you wanted with it, and there was absolutely nothing to stop you. And this extends to places like the Tower of London. And so Morris and the SPAB are frequently furious with the authorities at the Tower of London for like messing about with the historic structure of the building at the Tower. Even until about 1905, they were knocking down original fabric of the building to create like fake medieval stuff. I used to work there. I worked with the architectural drawings there, so I can tell you that is absolutely true. And so there is nothing in place. And so the SPAB is the first organisation to kind of really draw awareness. And it is from that things like English Heritage and the National Trust are founded. It's from that legislation appears in Parliament. I think it's about 1912, but I might be wrong, to kind of start protecting things. And so now, obviously, now we have listed building status, and you can't just do something with a historic building because you happen to own it, and then that obviously spreads out to the world. So it's not one of Morris's most, obviously it's not very visually appealing, it's not as sexy a subject as a lot of things about Morris, but actually it's so important. And probably in our everyday lives, that might be one of the most significant things that he did, even though most people would not necessarily be aware of that. So I think, landscape conservation, and he does, campaign about Epping Forest and not cutting down trees and that sort of thing. But I think the building aspect of it is his legacy in terms of conservation, for sure.
And it's with Wyspiański. I suppose he was recording historic Krakow, wanting to preserve that for future generations. So I think there's a sort of conservationist aspect to his life and work, you would say. But as I said before, reinterpreting it at the same time. And I think, the museums today, the Wyspiański Museum, they've spent a lot of time conserving his works. It's quite the output is quite fragmentary and a little bit site-specific, but I think he was so attentive to the materials he used that his works have actually endured. They have survived all the vicissitudes of the 20th century. It's remarkable that the windows remain intact. so many of the other creations as well. So I think there's a sort of, that's because of this respect for materials and wanting them to endure. But I think unlike the context in which Morris worked, which of course Britain was very industrialised by that time, I don't think industrialisation had impacted Poland in the same way. So a lot of the historic buildings are still there, but they are being reappropriated. And I think he wanted to perhaps restore them to their try to revive the original meaning and purpose. I don't know what you would think, Julia.
That's right. And Wyspiański was also involved in a number of straightforward renovation projects of historic buildings, in the renovation of medieval stained glass, in Kraków churches, and also some of the wonderful interior decoration projects. For example, at the Franciscan Church, which Alison mentioned, kind of verged on renovation projects. There was a crossover between the decorative and renovation work. He also set up the Society for the Lovers of Krakow's History and Historical Relics, and the conservation journal called the Kraków Annual. And he wrote a number of antiquarian articles, a little bit like Morris's gossip about the old house on the Upper Thames. So he had a passion for recording vernacular architecture. But as Alison said, he really wanted to reinterpret it for his time. One of his biggest regrets was that he wasn't afforded the privilege of working on the renovation of the reclaimed Wawel castle and cathedral.
Why did he die so young?
Wyspiański, you mean? Yes, unfortunately he contracted syphilis when he was studying in Paris. And that, like many people of that generation, there was no cure for it. So he was aware of this sort of terminal illness from around the late 1890s. So he was aware his time was limited, which might explain this extraordinary productivity. He actually died from liver failure, kidney failure, but the actual, the real cause was syphilis.
You mentioned about a big master for Wyspiański, which was Matejko. I would like to learn more about him, but also would like to know if also Morris has someone he admired who was his master in his works.
Well, for Morris, I mean, in terms of painting, it was Jan van Eyck. It's probably one of the biggest influences. So Morris, as Alison mentioned, goes to France and he goes to Belgium. And on his honeymoon, he and Jane go to Belgium. They go to Ghent and to Bruges, and they see the kind of the work of the Flemish primitives. And so Jan van Eyck is definitely amongst that. And Morris actually adopts Jan van Eyck's motto, which is kind of, if I can, if I can, I bloody well will, is the kind of the idea. But, he really kind of is influenced by the sort of Flemish sort of 15th century Flemish art, and especially as a young man, I think before he develops more of his own stylistic influences, it's Van Eyck and Northern European. He then becomes incredibly inspired by Middle Eastern and Islamic pattern from the Middle East, from the Islamic world more generally, from India. And so from the 1870s, 80s onwards, all of his patterns pretty much are completely inspired by art from the Middle East and Islamic world. And he says that Persia is a heaven for us pattern designers, because the level of pattern that comes from things like Persian carpets and textiles from that region is absolutely phenomenal. And so that's really the biggest source of his inspiration, so of his pattern inspiration, certainly from the 1870s until his death.
Well, Jan Matejko was Wyspiański's greatest inspiration up till his studies in Paris. During his studies in Paris, from 1891 until 1894, he actually writes in one of his letters that what he would like for his art to achieve would be to become a synthesis of the best in contemporary French art and the best in Master Matejko. And I think he successfully accomplishes that, both in terms of his subject matter and also in his style, combining the best of innovative history painting with the best of modern art.
But I think with Wyspiański, he's so eclectic. He absorbs influences from all over. And another important influence was Botticelli. He loved Botticelli, and Botticelli's Primavera was a great influence on his work, and particularly with this sort of, rather sort of melancholy, interiorized kind of female beauty, which he refers to in his plays, but you also see it in his portraits as well. So I think, Renaissance art is really important for Wyspiański, as well as Japanese art, which I've mentioned before. He loved Japanese prints. Ancient Greek vase painting is really important. Sculpture, his work has a very strong sculptural quality to it. So I think sculpture is important for Wyspiański. And then he was also aware of contemporary French artists, post-impressionists, such as Gauguin, the Pont-Aven painters. We mentioned Morris and Burne-Jones. Edvard Munch, he was aware of his work. So I think he absorbed influences from all over, but what you end up is sort of, echt Wyspiański. It's something which is peculiar to him alone.
Thank you. I think we'll finish on this thought. Thank you very much, Alison. Thank you, Roisin, and thank you, Julia. Let's give them a round of applause.
For upcoming events, please visit our website and follow us on social media.